The next part of photosynthesis is looking at actually how the process begins. So as you know, there are photosynthetic organisms. Not all organisms are capable of performing the process of photosynthesis. And the organisms that are capable of this are called autotrophs. The auto part translates to self, and troph has to do with feeding. So these are literally self-feeders. Dinoflagellates, which are this organism, it's a little single-celled protist. They're the ones responsible for the bioluminescence in the oceans. If you saw Apollo 13 and Tom Hanks's character playing Jim Lovell was talking about how he was able to find his aircraft carrier because the bioluminescence stirred up by the wake of the engines. So dinoflagellates can perform photosynthesis. Cyanobacteria, which is a form of bacteria that you'll look at in Bio 102, can perform photosynthesis. Euglena, or another protist, and you can see it has that green color from the chlorophyll. It contains chloroplasts and can do photosynthesis, as well as most plants that you're familiar with, trees and grasses and flowers. So think about this for a moment. Okay, from thermodynamics in the previous slideshow, previous video, you saw that energy and mass cannot be created or destroyed. So how is it possible then that you can start out with an acorn and seemingly create enough mass that you can get a sapling and then a tree? Where is all of this mass coming from? So pause the video and think about that, and by the end of this video, or the next, hopefully you'll be able to answer this. Okay, so photosynthesis is actually two separate processes. There's the photo part, which is sometimes called the light reaction or the light-dependent reaction, and there's the synthesis part, which is sometimes called the dark reaction or the light-independent reaction. And during the photo part, it's going to take place within the thylakoid, those little pancake-like structures that you saw within the chloroplast. It's going to require the input of sunlight, the input of water, and oxygen is going to be released during this part, the light-dependent part of photosynthesis. Then a whole separate process is going to begin, and this one requires carbon dioxide. It also requires the energy that was produced during the photo part. This is going to take place within the stroma, and this is where the sugar, the final output, is going to take place. So for photosynthesis to occur, a plant is going to need sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide. It's also going to need, it's going to put out from this process oxygen as a waste product or a byproduct, and sugar. So photosynthesis is going to take place in the chloroplasts, which are one of the organelles within the cell of plant cells. If we look at the leaf and then we cut it in section, we can see the stomata, which are going to allow the carbon dioxide in, and they're going to allow the oxygen, the waste product, to come out of the leaf. And we see these tiny little green structures, mostly within the mesophyll. And if we look in close at those, we can see that these are chloroplasts. And if we look at a section of a chloroplast, we're going to see the structures that you looked at last week when we talked about organelles. We have the stroma, which is sort of analogous to the cytoplasm, but in a chloroplast. We have that double membrane, the outer membrane and the inner membrane. We have the individual thylakoids, the little pancake structures. And within the thylakoid, we have the thylakoid space, or the thylakoid lumen. And so these two places, the thylakoid membrane and the lumen, and the stroma, are where photosynthesis is going to occur. And so, again, a little bit closer up, the stroma is where the dark reaction, or the light-independent reaction, is going to take place. And within each of these thylakoids, each of these little pancake stacks, we're going to have the light part, or the light-dependent part of photosynthesis occurring within the membrane of the thylakoid and within the lumen, the interior portion of the thylakoid. So light energy travels in waves. It travels both in waves and is made up of these discrete packets of energy called photons. The length of the wave, or the wavelength, is going to determine the amount of energy that the photon contains, and it so happens that each wavelength of energy is going to be used by a different pigment, a different chlorophyll molecule on the membrane of the thylakoids. So it's going to be important that we understand just a little bit about the electromagnetic spectrum and the different wavelengths of light. So as we look at the entire electromagnetic spectrum, we can see that it is structured by looking at the different wavelengths, how much space there is between the crest of one wave to the crest of the next part of the wave, or the trough to the next trough. And we can see that on the gamma ray end, there's a lot of danger in here because this can turn you into Hulk. The wavelengths are very, very close. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, there's a great distance between each crest, and we have a very large wavelength. So radio waves have the least amount of energy in this section of the electromagnetic spectrum, and gamma radiation, or gamma rays, have the most amount of heat in the smallest wavelengths. And if we look sort of in the middle here, we see the visible light spectrum, and it's broken down into the colors of the rainbow. You may be familiar with the acronym ROY-G-BIV. We have the red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet colors of the spectrum. And as we look at the next slide, we're going to see that these two have the same pattern, that red has the largest wavelength, has the least amount of energy, and violet has the smallest wavelength and has the most amount of energy within it. So if we look at chlorophyll is just a pigment, just like we have pigments in our skin, which cause it to have different colors. There are different types of chlorophyll, and each one responds to a different wavelength of energy. When this packet of energy hits the chlorophyll molecule, the molecule is going to absorb this energy and it's going to excite electrons. And there are, again, different types of chlorophyll. We're looking at two of them here. And no, I did not spell this. This was something that I borrowed from the internet. So I know that chlorophyll is spelled with a PH and a Y and not an F and an I. But chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, as you can see, are two different pigments. And they have highs on this graph where they do well at absorbing that particular wavelength of energy. And they're very low where they do poorly and where they tend to reflect most of this energy. And there actually are three important pigments. There are a series of others that are not quite as abundant, but chlorophyll A, you can see in the dark green here, it does quite well absorbing the colors in the violet and blue end of the spectrum. Then it really tapers off, does not do well in green, does not do well in yellow, doesn't really do well in orange either, but picks up and does very well absorbing lights in the red end of the spectrum. Chlorophyll B does well in a different part of the spectrum. It does okay in the indigo and the blue range, but it doesn't do well in the green or the yellow, and then it picks up again in the orange. And the carotenoids, a different type of chlorophyll, does fairly well in the green and kind of blue indigo portions. And so when you have a leaf that has all of these, what we're going to see are the colors that are not absorbed, the colors that are reflected. And really, none of these do all that well in the green portion of the spectrum. They're not really able to absorb green light. They reflect it, and therefore we see leaves as being green. So think about these two, and when you come up with your answer, unpause the video. And hopefully you realize that I sort of just answered this question accidentally, and you would expect that chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B do not absorb green, because we see plants as being green. And given what we know about the pigments, The reason that we see fall colors is that slowly chlorophyll A, the production of that tapers off in the beginning of the fall, and as it does, the reds and oranges stop being absorbed, and so we start to see reds and oranges. Then as chlorophyll B begins to peter off, we see more of the orange and yellows, and maybe even some blues, although there aren't that many blue leaves. And then finally, when the carotenoids die out, then the leaves fall off of the trees. And you can see here, as we look at the different portions of what is absorbed, when everything, all of the pigments are being produced, we see the green leaves of the oaks. And when the chlorophyll A and then chlorophyll B begin to, or the production of those ceases, then we see those lovely fall colors, and we get the yellows, the oranges, and the reds being produced. So photons are what cause the electrons to be excited and what jump starts this process of the light-dependent portion of photosynthesis. And when we have a photon that comes in, this is in the 500 nanometer spectrum, so we're in the probably indigo portion here. When the photon hits the particular, oh, I'm sorry, this wouldn't be, 500 would be in the blue end of the spectrum. So when we hit the 500 nanometer, it's hitting a carotenoid molecule that is able to absorb that wavelength, that energy photon. It's going to convert some of the energy that it had of motion into energy that's going to excite an electron on that carotenoid molecule so that it raises up. It may have been in, say, the second or third electron orbital, and it's going to jump up to maybe the fifth or the sixth electron orbital. It might land back on this same molecule, or what it might do instead is jump to a different molecule where it will then excite an electron over here, and we can have the electron essentially jumping from molecule to molecule, exciting another one as it goes. And this is the chief way that energy is going to move through a cell, by the excitation and motion movement of electrons from one molecule to the next. So with the photo part, the light reaction part, that again is going to take place on the membrane of the thylakoid, here we have the thylakoid, and there's the thylakoid membrane with the lumen on the inside, stroma on the outside. We're going to have a photon of light come in and hit the first photosystem. This is a protein. You can recognize the protein in its placement in the phospholipid bilayer of the thylakoid membrane. It's going to excite an electron, which is going to then jump from this protein to the next, to another, and to another. And if you notice, it's kind of dropping downwards. It's like a ball that bounces, where you hold a ball above your head and let it go. It's not going to jump all the way back to your hand. It's going to maybe go back up to where your face is. And if you catch it there and let it go again, it's not going to rebound all the way up to your face. It might go up to your mid-chest. So each time it's going to lose some of that energy. It's not going to lose it, rather. It's going to be converted into another form of energy like sound and heat. Well, the same thing is going to happen. Each time the electron bounces from one protein to the next, it's going to have lost a little bit of its energy because it will have converted it to exciting an electron on that new protein. So what we're going to need here is the sunlight, so that photon can hit that first protein. And each time one of these electrons bounces, each time it's lost from that molecule, a proton, a hydrogen atom, is going to be moved along as well. And to replace the hydrogen atom that was present there, what the thylakoid is going to do is take the water molecule and rip it apart into its two hydrogens and its oxygen. And after this happens twice, oxygen is going to be released, and the energy of these electrons bouncing along this protein chain is going to be used to attach the phosphate molecule back onto an ADP to reform ATP. We're going to look at this production on the next set of slides. So at first, this light energy is going to come in. It's going to hit this second photosystem, photosystem 2. This is going to convert some of the energy from the light into energy that's going to excite an electron. And the electron is going to jump from this protein over to the next one. The primary electron acceptor is going to grab that electron and send them along the series of proteins, which is called the electron transport chain. And to replace the electrons that were sent to the electron transport chain, water molecules are going to be split. So we have the water molecule come in, and it's going to be broken up into hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms. And after two of them get split, two water molecules get split, we'll have oxygen 2, O2, which is going to be released into the atmosphere. And the H pluses, the hydrogens, are going to replace the electrons that have just been bouncing along. So this is the water splitting part of the first portion, the light-dependent portion of photosynthesis. Next comes this electron transport chain, which again are these series of other proteins. And so electrons are going to move through these series of proteins, and each time they're going to fall down to a slightly lower energy state. But they still have enough energy to excite another electron as they bounce along their way down this chain. The released energy is going to power a protein pump. It's going to allow a protein molecule to force hydrogen molecules against their gradient from the stroma, where they're less compacted, where they have a lower concentration, into the lumen of the thylakoid, where they're already at a higher concentration. That's why this takes energy. You're going to force them against their gradient from the stroma into the lumen, packing them in, powering this proton pump by the motion of the electron. And once the thylakoid lumen has a large number of these these hydrogen atoms, the hydrogen is going to jump through this other protein, this enzyme, ATP synthase, and they're going to be released out of that with a large amount of kinetic energy, which is going to enable the conversion into potential energy, where ADP and an extra phosphate molecule are going to be bonded together to form ATP. And you can kind of imagine in a stylized way the electron transport chain as these series of protein funnels. Each time the electron moves to one and then the next and then the next proteins, it's going to lose a little bit of energy because it gave some of its energy to allow these hydrogen atoms to move against their gradient from the stroma into the lumen. It bounces down the next one, and the hydrogen moves from the stroma into the lumen. The electron moves again, gives enough energy for a hydrogen to move from the stroma into the lumen. And eventually, we're going to have such a large number of these hydrogen atoms inside the lumen that they're going to sort of explode out back into the stroma, and the energy of them being moved through this protein is going to enable an ADP and a phosphate molecule to rejoin and turn into ATP, a high energy molecule that the cell can use later. And so then we move to the second photosystem, which is the NADPH producing photosystem, which is very similar to the water splitting photosystem. but the electrons are donated to the second electron transport chain instead of the first one. And instead of moving to the ATP synthase, it's going to move to a different protein, which is going to take NADP and force the hydrogen molecule back onto it. This is NADP plus. It takes a lot of energy to take a plus and another plus and shove them together. So NADPH is another high energy molecule, just like ATP was. And so the products of this first portion of photosynthesis, the photo portion, or the light dependent, is we're going to get oxygen, ATP, and NADPH. Oxygen is a byproduct of this reaction. It's just a waste product that the plant is going to release, but it's going to keep that ATP and that NADPH so that it has energy for the next portion of photosynthesis. So think about these for a moment. I'm not going to answer them now, but just kind of think about them, and when you're ready, advance the slide.